Welcome back to this series on building a movie recommendation system using machine learning. And in this episode, which is the fourth episode, we're going to be focusing on how to build API to consume our model using FastAPI. So in the previous episodes, we've looked at how to load our data, experiment, train our model, organize our files, and then building the final model and having it work with MLflow. Now we want to build the API to consume the model using MLflow. So to do that, we will go into our source file. So we are having a lot of our code under the SRC, and we're going to create a new folder, and we can call it API. Okay. Then inside API, let's create a main.py, main.py. Now we have the main.py. This is where we're going to be having our FastAPI. So the first thing we'll do is we import the required libraries. I have required libraries to build our API here, and we'll go through them. So we have that, and we have the FastAPI imported. We have the Pydantic, which is what we use for our base model to be able to send the recommendation request. We have our pandas, which is what helps us package the input as a data frame that we send into the model. Then we have other libraries, but the important ones are the context lib, the middleware, and of course our utils, which is the configure MLflow. And we see how we apply each of these libraries as we move on. So for our API, the first thing we need to do is we need to have, just like what we have in the prediction phase, we needed this model URI as used in the prediction phase, but now we want the API to handle all those things. We still need this part of the code, which is the model name and the model version. So we have that there within the code. Let me close this part. Then the first chunk of thing that we need to do is to have the recommendation request. And recommendation request is what the API uses to send a request to be able to get the required recommendation. So this is recommend request. It can be any other thing, but to make it clear with respect to the problem that we are solving. So if you remember in our prediction, we need to have the title, right? The title, which is in data frame, the title and the top key. And that is the same thing that is happening with our recommendation request. So we make that work that way. Then the next thing we do after that is we need to have, if we have a recommendation request, we need to have a recommendation response. So, and what comes as our response, if we go to our predict, what we get as our response is usually the title of the movie and the recommendation. That is what we did here when we zipped this together as key value here, where the key is the title and the recommendation is like a list, which are the predictions that we have. So we have the title and the recommendations. And that is the same thing that we're going to be having in the recommendation response. So this is recommend response. So you can see, so the title, which is a string, then the recommendation, which is a list, as explained in the predict part. So if that is not clear, you can go back to the episode 3 and see the video and be able to understand how we got to this point. Now we have the recommendation request, we pass in the base model that we imported here, so that the API is able to understand, okay, this is the request and this is the expected response. So we need to define those two classes. The next thing we need to do is the context manager. And I'm going to bring in the code and explain it individually. Now, for the context manager, like just like the name, it helps us to manage the context of what is going on within the API. And if we go line by line, we have this asynchronous function that is the lifespan, okay? And we have the configure MLflow within the asynchronous function. And what is happening here is that this will help the model to be loaded on startup. So whenever we start the system, whenever FastAPI is running, what will happen is it will load the model into the system directly. So that is what is happening. So on startup of FastAPI, the model will be loaded. So we use the model URI because we need to be able to get the model from somewhere, just like what we have over here, the model URI. Okay, that is there. Then we need to set the state. So the state is what helps the API to understand what is currently within the system that is running within the system, and we can then apply the model in other parts of the API by the time we are writing our endpoint. So that is what this part is doing, the app.state.model. So you have the mofload.python.load model. So we are loading the model into state that is, it is readily available to be used. So that is what that is. So if you want to learn more about app state in FastAPI, you can just go to Google and say app states, and you can see the different classes that we explain the state objects and everything you need to learn about FastAPI. So you can always come into FastAPI documentation to read that. So I'll go back to the code. So what it's just doing is it's making the model available to be used across the whole application. And the last part here is to just give us a status. What is happening? Because it is good to know if the model is loaded successfully or not. So if that is successful, it's going to say print the model URL, just say the loaded model from this model URL. And the yield, what the yield is doing is something very interesting. So the yield is helping us to keep the function running, because normally if we just have return means, oh, that function is done. So whatever we are returning will return, but that function is done. But the yield keeps the function running, it keeps it there. Okay, and let's say we have another code to run after yield, the function will still run after specific action is initiated. So the function keeps running. That is what the yield is doing. That's what the yield is doing. So to explain the yield, I will do an example of making a count. So let's say I have a function to count something, and I say count, it takes no parameter, and I say yield 1, yield 2, yield 2, and I say yield 3. So when I have this, and I take this function, let me not run it here so that I don't disturb the flow. And let's say I go to Google Colab, and I open colab.research.google.com, and I open a new notebook, and just wait for that quickly. All right, that is loaded. I paste the function in, and I run the function. Okay, Colab is connecting. Now it is connected. Now, for me to use this function, when I use yield, of course, on a normal graph Python, I will need to store it. Let's say I store it into C, for example. And I can run it directly also at the same time. And this is C. Now, for every time I want to run the function, I will need to use nest. And if I say nest C, so every time that I run nest, it's going to run the next thing within that function. So it keeps working. So this function doesn't just run once. It will like take the pause, hold things together in the system. So when I run it using nest, it knows what nest to do. So it's just going to say yield 2, yield 3. So that is the way it works in this Python code. And that is why it is important in our FastAPI to use. You see, this gives us 3. And if I have yield up to 100, that just continues that way. So that is what I'm trying to explain with how the yield works. So it keeps this running. So it is not the end of the function. That's why we have it like the asynchronous function, which is this lifespan. So the next thing we need to do is then to now initiate our FastAPI application itself. So this is our FastAPI app is equal to FastAPI, and this function will be consumed. This lifespan function will then be consumed within FastAPI. So we have our title, which is movie recommended API, our version, it could be anything, and we have a description. Then the lifespan, then we pass in this asynchronous function, which is coming into the FastAPI application. So that is how we use that. So having this now, we can then move to our endpoint. But before the endpoint, I think one of the things that is very important is having our middleware, because our middleware is what allows the API to be able to interact with whatsoever we set up in the system. That is what is showing on the web. Whenever a request is made, the middleware handles all that together. But before we have our middleware, we need to have the origins set up. So there's the origin, and the origin is simply like the link. So if it is like an application that is being deployed, of course, it's not really going to be localhost. It will be the domain name or the domain network, the DNS of the domain of the platform where the site is being hosted. So, but in this case, it is local, but the origin is this. Then we have our middleware setup. So we set it up using the app.middleware because it is a part of the FastAPI instance. So we have the app.middleware. We call this CRS middleware, the CORS middleware that was imported from FastAPI. That's because then we have other parameters that are passed into the middleware, which is the allow origin, and the allowed origins, they are these origins. We pass it there. The allow credentials, we pass it there. That is, everything should work as they should, like cookies and several of those other things. That will be allowed. Then the allow methods, there are different methods that we use when we build our API. You have the get method, the post method, the put method. We can see different methods. So let me say FastAPI methods. So it makes it clear. So if I say FastAPI methods, you can see the different kind of methods that we have in FastAPI. Okay, let me say FastAPI. So you can see this get is a kind of method that is in FastAPI, and you have other kind of methods that you use when we build our application. So get is what we use to get something from the database, and post, we use to post information. We send information to the API. Get, we return a specific response from the API. So that is how that works. And they are the ones to update the database through the API, which is like the put, to make updates. We have the delete and different kind of methods that we can use. But here we are saying allow method. That is, allow all methods, all the methods that are available in FastAPI, and allow headers, these with like some browser content headers and others, other information. So we just have this there. And then we can now move into building our endpoint. So the first endpoint that we're going to have is going to be a get. is going to use a get method. So app.get, and the endpoint is called health. Okay. Now, when we build this, what this is just doing is we want to use it to check if our API is really serving anything. So to check the health, it will just return the status, which is okay. So that is all that this is doing. So that helps us to get, okay, the status of the system. Is it okay? If it is not okay, then it will return error. If it is okay, it will just return okay. So that is very important, just to check the status of the system before checking the other parts of the endpoint. Then the other thing that we need to have here is then the recommend method. So we have the health method to check, then we have the recommend method. And the recommend method is going to be a post method. It's going to be a post method. So I'll do an example here. We do it here. So it's going to be a post method. The reason it is a post method is because, let me escape this, is because we are sending information through the API, then getting a response back. So it is a post method. Then when the post method goes, it needs to return a response. That's why we have the response model. Remember, we set it up here. So we have the recommend response that we define as a class over here. So that is going to then help us get the response from whatever is being posted into the system. So we send into the system, then we get the information back. So it works as a post method. And what we need to define within this is we need to now use the model within this method. So here now we are using the model using the state, the model that is served in the state of the application, where you now have the benefit of this app.state.model, where we've been able to get the model and it has been loaded into state. That is, it has been loaded into the system already, and we can then use the model in this part of the application. If we hadn't done that, then we need to do all those processes right here again from scratch. So now that this is set up, we need to have our input. Remember, our input is a data frame. So we say the input df, just the way we have it in the prediction that we do here, input df, just what we have here, we have the same thing back here. So the only difference that is here is that in our recommend function that is working in this endpoint, you can see the parameter is the request. And the request is simply this recommend request, that is what is being requested. So the recommend request, where we have the title and the top K. So to make that work, we need to have the title within the data frame, but the value of the title is going to be request.title. Request.title. Then the top K is request.topk, which we've defined over here already. We've defined it under this class already. So whatever is being received within this class is passed into this data frame, and this data frame can then be used to make prediction in the end. So let's work with the prediction line. So the prediction is made using the model that we've served into the state, and we can make the prediction. And so the next line is the recommendation. And here in the recommendation, we have a ternary operator. And what the ternary operator is doing is to ensure that we don't get any index error as our output in whatever we do. So it helps us avoid index error. So you can see here, if the length of the prediction, that is greater than 0, so which means if the prediction contains a value or contains the list that we expect to get, then it will return the first thing that is within the prediction. But if it is not, it will just return an empty array. So empty list, which means this will not return index error in case we have a movie that we are searching for and it is not available in our database or was not trained with our model. So there will not be anything like index error. So that is what this ternary operation is doing. All right. So the next thing is to return the recommended response. And what we get from the recommendation is return the recommended response, which is what we defined initially. Return the recommended response, that is title. From the recommended response will be the request.title. Then the recommendation is these recommendations that we have, just the way we set it up from here. So if you see, we have the title, then we have the recommend. So to get that back, we get the title, which is the request.title. That is the request we passed in. We get the title. Then the recommendations is the recommendations we have in the end. So based on this, we should have our model or our API working perfectly, and our model is working perfectly with our API. So we can test to see what is happening. And to test it, we'll run it using the UVCon. So I'm just going to open this terminal again, and we use the UVCon. We've installed the UVCon while installing FastAPI before, and this will help us load the application. So we run it to see what is going to happen. But remember that for this to run, our ML flow is running. So I have the ML flow running in the system from the previous episode. So I didn't kill the terminal. So that has been running. So if you want to see the ML flow, how we did it, you can check the previous episode where we worked with the ML flow and DVC. So now we can check our API and see what is working and what is not. So we can use the link and go into our browser. And within our browser, we can check. You can see it returns detailed not found. Of course, that is because it is our API, a fast API, not like a web page in itself. So for us to get where the information is, we need to put /docd/docs. So that we open it. So we run the first, you can see the first endpoint we have. We can check, this is to check the system and say try it out, and I'll click on execute. So let's check the response. You can see the response is okay. That's working fine. All right. Then we want to do the post, run the post method, which is this endpoint of recommend. And we say try it out. We set this default in as the default value, and our setup, everything is well set up. Then we can run this and try it out. Then I'll say execute, and voila, we have the recommendations. Isn't this beautiful? So let me try true crimes, or true crime, anyone. And I'll say execute, and I have response. So interesting, so nice. Yeah, so that is what we have in the API. So our API is working perfectly. Our API is working perfectly. So based on this, now we can move into the next episode where we're going to be building the React application to consume this API. So thank you for joining this episode of this series. And if this has helped you, or you've learned something new or something useful, feel free to like or make a comment if you have a question. Also share the video around for other people who wants to learn something. However, what is very important is you need to subscribe so that you can get notified whenever I upload a new video. So till the 5th episode, where we talk about the React application and we build the application to consume this API. Thank you very much, and see you.